The world smelled like rain and old books the day my father left. I was 8 years old, and my universe was the size of our small two-story house, with a yard that was mostly mud and a swing set that creaked like a sad old man. I remember the color of the sky was a flat, boring gray, the kind that makes you want to stay inside and draw with the good crayons, the ones that weren't broken. I was doing just that, sprawled on the living room rug, trying to get the perfect shade of sunshine yellow for a lion's mane, when the quiet got loud. It's funny how silence can have a sound. It was a heavy silence, thick with things I didn't have the words for yet. Mom, Sarah, was standing by the window, not looking at the rain, but through it, like she was trying to see a different day. Her hands were wrapped around a coffee mug, but she wasn't drinking. Her knuckles were white. Dad, James, was standing by the front door, holding the suitcase I'd helped him pack the summer before for our trip to the beach. It was a happy suitcase then, full of swimming trunks and silly hats. Now it just looked sad and brown. He had his back to me, but I could feel his shoulders were tight. They were talking in whispers, the kind that are sharper than shouts. I couldn't hear the words, just the hiss of them, like snakes in the grass. I stopped coloring. My yellow crayon rolled under the couch. I didn't try to get it. I just watched them. My two favorite people in the world, looking like strangers from one of the black and white movies Mom sometimes watched on Sunday afternoons. "Please, James," Mom's voice cracked, just a little. It was a tiny sound, but it made the whole room feel like it was breaking. He shook his head. A slow, tired movement. He turned then, and his eyes found me on the floor. His face was usually full of smiles, the kind that made little crinkles appear by his eyes. I loved those crinkles, but they weren't there now. His face was a blank page. He tried to smile, but it was a wobbly, broken thing. "Hey, Sophie Bug," he said. His voice was too bright, like a light bulb about to burn out. "I've got to go away for a little while." I scrambled to my feet, the drawing of the lion forgotten. "Are we going to the beach again? I can pack my swimsuit," I said, my heart doing a little flip-flop of excitement. A trip meant no school. It meant ice cream and Dad burying me in the sand. His broken smile faltered. He glanced at Mom, a quick, painful look. She just stared out the window, her shoulders trembling. "No, sweetie, not this time. This is just a trip for me," he said, kneeling down so he was my height. He smelled like his aftershave and something else. Something like sadness. "I need you to be a good girl for your mom, okay? You be a big helper for her." I didn't understand. "But why can't I come? I'm a good helper." My lips started to tremble. I was a good helper. I helped set the table, even if I sometimes put the forks on the wrong side. I helped with the garden, even if I mostly just dug for worms. He pulled me into a hug. It was a tight, desperate hug, and for a second I couldn't breathe. He buried his face in my hair, and I felt something wet on my cheek. I thought it was just the rain from outside that had somehow gotten in. "I love you more than all the stars in the sky, Sophie Bug," he whispered into my ear. "Never, ever forget that." And then he let go. He stood up, picked up the sad, brown suitcase, and walked out the door. He didn't look back. The click of the door shutting was the loudest sound I had ever heard. It echoed in the loud silence. The rain started to fall harder, hitting the windows like tiny fists. I stood there, frozen, staring at the door, waiting for it to open again, waiting for him to say it was all a big joke, but it stayed closed. I looked at Mom. She hadn't moved from the window. Her back was still to me. The only sound was the coffee mug finally clattering into the sink, and then her shaky breaths. I walked over to her, my small hand reaching for hers. Her skin was cold. "Mommy?" I asked, my voice a tiny whisper. "Where did Daddy go?" She turned from the window, and her face was a mess of tears and anger. Her eyes, usually so warm, were like chips of ice. She looked down at me, and it felt like she wasn't seeing me, her daughter, but something else. Something she hated. She knelt, grabbing my arms, her fingers digging into my skin. And then she leaned in close, her breath hot and smelling of coffee and sorrow. She whispered the words that would roll under the couch of my memory and stay there forever, just like my lost yellow crayon. "You're the reason he left." Her words didn't make sense. They were just sounds, jumbled and sharp, that pricked my skin. "You're the reason." Me? I was the reason Daddy left? I was his Sophie Bug. I was the one he loved more than all the stars. Stars are a lot. I'd tried to count them once, sitting on his shoulders in the backyard, but I always lost my place. He said it didn't matter, because his love was bigger than any number I could think of. How could a love that big be chased away by a little girl who was still missing two of her front teeth? I pulled back from her, my arms stinging where her fingers had been. I think I was supposed to cry, but the tears were stuck somewhere in my throat, tangled up with all the questions I was too scared to ask. My mother's face, which had been so close and so terrifying, was already turning away again. She stood up and walked into the kitchen as if she hadn't just dropped a boulder onto my 8-year-old heart. I heard the water run, the clink of dishes being moved with unnecessary force. She was building a wall of noise between us. I was left alone in the living room with the gray light and the ghost of my father's hug. I looked at the front door. He was gone. I looked toward the kitchen. She was gone too, in a different way. It felt like my whole family had vanished in the time it takes to color a lion's mane. I didn't know what to do. The house was suddenly full of instructions I couldn't hear. Be a good girl. Be a big helper. You're the reason he left. The sentences crashed into each other in my head. If I was the reason he left, then being a good girl wouldn't bring him back. Maybe being a bad girl had sent him away. Was it because I'd spilled my juice on the rug last week? Mom had been angry, her voice tight. "This is why we can't have nice things, Sophie," she'd said. Or was it because I'd cried when I scraped my knee, and Dad had carried me all the way home, telling Mom she was being too fussy when she wanted to put the stinging antiseptic on it? They had whispered snakes in the grass that night, too. I started to replay everything. Every tantrum, every messy meal, every time I'd begged for one more story at bedtime. Each memory was a clue. I was a detective in a crime I didn't know I had committed. The weight of it was heavier than the sad brown suitcase he'd carried out the door. The next few days were a blur of gray. The rain outside stopped, but the storm inside our house just grew colder. Mom moved like a shadow. She made my meals: toast for breakfast, a sandwich for lunch, pasta for dinner. The food was always bland, always the same. We ate in silence. The clinking of my fork against the plate was a cannon blast in the quiet. I tried to be perfect. I ate every bite, even the crusts I hated. I cleared my plate. I sat with my hands in my lap. I was a statue of a good little girl. But she never looked at me. Not really. Her eyes would skim past me, focusing on the wall behind my head, or the salt shaker on the table. It was like I was turning invisible. One night, I couldn't stand the silence anymore. Dad always used to read to me before bed. It was our thing. He would do all the voices, making the big bad wolf sound gruff and the little pig sound squeaky and scared. I missed his voice. I missed the weight of his arm around my shoulders. I crept out of my room, holding my favorite book, the one about a lost star trying to find its way home. I found her on the couch staring at the blank television screen. The room was dark except for a single lamp that cast long, scary shadows. "Mommy," I whispered. She jumped, startled. For a second, her face was just my mom, tired and sad. Then the mask slipped back on. "What is it, Sophie? You should be in bed." Will you read to me?" I asked, holding out the book. It felt as heavy as a brick. She stared at the book, then at me. Her expression was flat, unreadable. "I'm not your father, Sophie. I don't do the silly voices." She turned her head back to the dark screen. "Go to bed." The rejection was a physical thing. It was a cold hand squeezing my chest. I wasn't asking for silly voices. I was asking for her. I was the lost star, and she wouldn't even open the book to help me find my way. I backed away, clutching the story to my chest, and went back to my room. I didn't cry. I just lay in my bed, in the dark, and understood. The house wasn't quiet because Dad was gone. It was quiet because Mom's love had gone with him. And somehow, it was all my fault. School started again in September, and the world outside my front door acted like nothing had changed. The leaves on the maple tree in the schoolyard still turned a brilliant, fiery red. The other kids still screamed and laughed during recess, trading stickers and secrets. But I was a ghost in a playground full of life. I had learned the art of being small, of taking up less space. My voice, which used to be loud and full of questions, stayed tucked away in my throat. At lunchtime, I'd sit by myself at the end of a bench, eating the silent sandwiches Mom had packed, and I'd watch the other girls braid each other's hair. I never asked to join in. Rejection had a taste, and I'd had my fill of it at home. The silence in our house had changed. It was no longer a loud, angry silence. It had settled, like dust, into every corner of our lives. It was the air we breathed. Mom got a job working at a law office downtown. Her name was Sarah, but now she was Ms. Evans. She bought new clothes, stiff blouses and dark skirts, and she'd come home late, her face pale and tired under the harsh kitchen light. She never asked about my day, and I stopped trying to tell her about it. What was there to say? That my teacher said my drawings were sad? That I didn't have a partner for the science project? These felt like complaints. and I was terrified of being a problem. Problems were why people left. My father's memory began to feel like a dream I was trying to hold on to. His photographs were gone from the mantelpiece, tucked away in a box I couldn't find. But he hadn't vanished completely. One day, while looking for the board games in the hall closet, I found one of his old sweaters. It was a thick blue wool sweater he used to wear when we'd go for walks in the autumn. I pulled it out from behind a stack of old blankets, and I buried my face in it. It still smelled a little bit like him, like wood smoke and the mints he always kept in his pocket. That sweater became my secret. Every night after Mom was asleep, I would sneak it out of the closet and take it to my bed. I'd curl up with it, the rough wool against my cheek, and pretend it was his arm around me. I'd whisper all my secrets to the sweater. I told it about the boy who pulled my hair on the bus and about the A I got on my spelling test. I told it that I missed the crinkles by his eyes when he smiled. The sweater was a very good listener. It never told me to go to bed. It never told me I was the reason for anything. Sometimes, late at night, I would hear a soft sound coming from my mother's bedroom. It was a choked, quiet sound, the kind of sound someone makes when they are trying to cry without anyone hearing. The first time I heard it, I almost got out of bed. I almost went to her. I wanted to hug her and tell her it was okay. But then my feet froze on the cold wooden floor. What if she looked at me with those icy eyes again? What if she told me her tears were my fault too? So I would creep back into bed and pull the blue sweater a little tighter. Her sadness was a private, scary country, and I didn't have a passport. The day I turned 9 arrived on a Tuesday. It was a gray, drizzly day, almost exactly like the day he'd left. I woke up half expecting the world to feel different, but it didn't. When I went down to the kitchen, there was a small cupcake on a plate on the table, with a single unlit candle stuck in the middle. Mom was already dressed for work, pouring coffee into a travel mug. "Happy birthday, Sophie," she said, her voice flat. She didn't look at me. "Thanks," I mumbled. We sat in silence as I ate the cupcake. It was sweet, but it tasted like loneliness. After I finished, she pushed a small, neatly wrapped box across the table. "This is for you." My fingers trembled a little as I opened it. Inside, nestled in white tissue paper, was a doll. She had perfect, shiny blonde hair and a beautiful dress the color of a summer sky. She was the most beautiful doll I had ever seen. "She's pretty," I said. "Her name is Annabelle," Mom said, still not looking at me. "I have to go, or I'll be late for work. Don't be late for the bus." She rinsed her mug in the sink and walked out the door. There was no hug. No, "I love you." I was left at the table with Annabelle. I picked her up. Her plastic face was smooth and perfect. Her painted-on smile would never falter. She was a perfect daughter, sitting in a perfect dress. Annabelle would never spill juice. She would never cry over a scraped knee or ask for a story. She would never talk too loud or make a mess or be a problem. She would never be the reason a father would pack a sad brown suitcase and walk out the door. I held her tight, but she felt cold, and all I could think was that I wished I was her. The years between 9 and 13 were like a long, quiet hallway. I walked down it on tiptoe. Annabelle, the perfect doll, sat on a shelf in my room, her painted smile gathering a thin layer of dust. I'd outgrown her, but I kept her there as a reminder of the kind of daughter I was supposed to be. Silent, pretty, and break-proof. My father's blue sweater was not on a shelf. It was hidden under my mattress, flattened and faded from years of being my only confidant. It didn't smell like him anymore. It just smelled like my room and my own quiet tears. But it was still a piece of him. A tangible link to the man who loved me more than all the stars. The dream of him was fraying at the edges, but I held on to it with the fierce grip of a drowning person. Mom and I continued our silent orbit around each other. She worked longer hours. Her face had more lines around the eyes, but they weren't the happy crinkles my father had. They were lines of worry and exhaustion. We were two strangers sharing a mortgage and a grocery bill. The house was clean, the meals were regular, but it was a home without a heart. The boulder she had dropped on me that rainy afternoon had never been mentioned again. It just sat between us, unmovable and cold. One evening, when I was 13, I was doing my homework at the kitchen table while Mom was on the phone in the other room. She was talking to her sister, my Aunt Carol. Usually their conversations were about boring adult things, work, bills, the price of gas. But this time, I heard a name that made my pencil stop mid-sentence. "I just don't know what James was thinking, Carol," Mom said, her voice a low, frustrated hum. "He sends the check every month like clockwork, but never a note, never a call for her birthday. It's like he fell off the face of the earth." My heart started to pound. A check. He sent a check. He hadn't forgotten us completely. He was out there somewhere. A new kind of determination, sharp and unfamiliar, took root in my chest. After she hung up, I waited. I waited until I heard the shower running in her bathroom. Then, with shaking hands, I went to her desk in the small office nook off the living room. It was a place I wasn't supposed to go, her private territory. I found her checkbook. My hands were slick with sweat as I flipped through the register. And there it was. Check after check, deposited on the first of every month. And next to one of the entries, scribbled in the margin, was a phone number. It was just 10 digits, but it felt like a map to a hidden treasure. I copied it down on a scrap of paper, my handwriting barely legible. I hid the paper in my pocket, my heart thumping against my ribs like a trapped bird. For a week, the number was a burning secret in my pocket. I would take it out and stare at it. What would I say? What if he was angry that I called? What if he didn't remember me? Finally, on a Saturday afternoon when Mom was at the grocery store, I found the courage. I took the cordless phone into my bedroom and shut the door. My fingers felt fat and clumsy as I punched in the numbers. It rang once, twice. My breath hitched in my throat. I was about to hang up when a woman answered. "Hello?" she said. Her voice was light and cheerful. I froze. Who was this? Hello? I stammered. Is James there? Just a minute, she said brightly. I heard her call out, "Honey, it's for you." Honey. The word was a slap. He was someone's honey. Then, his voice came on the line. It was him. It was older, deeper than I remembered from the dream of him, but it was him. "This is James," he said. All the words I had practiced vanished. My throat closed up. "Daddy?" The word came out as a squeak. There was a long silence on the other end. So long I thought he had hung up. "Sophie?" he finally asked. His voice was different now. Guarded. "It's me," I whispered, tears starting to blur my vision. I found your number. I miss you." "Sophie, you shouldn't have called this number," he said, his voice strained. "This is my home." "I know," I said, confused. "I just wanted to talk to you." "Listen," he said, and he sounded tired. So tired. "Things are complicated. I have a family now, Sophie. A wife. 2 little boys. 2 little boys. Not a sad brown suitcase. A wife. Honey." The words were like stones hitting me one by one. The lost star from my favorite book hadn't just gotten lost. It had been replaced by a whole new constellation, and I wasn't in it. "Oh," I said. It was the only sound I could make. "I'm happy you're doing well," he said, his voice full of a false brightness that reminded me of the day he left. "But you and your mother, that's a different part of my life. It's in the past. It's better this way. Please don't call again." And then he hung up. The dial tone buzzed in my ear, loud and mocking. He didn't say he loved me. He didn't ask about school. He didn't say he missed me. "It's better this way. Please don't call again. You're the reason he left." The whispers all came together, shouting in my head. My mother hadn't lied. I was the reason. I was the piece of his past he had to cut away to be happy. I don't know how long I sat on my bed, the phone still pressed to my ear. When Mom came home, she found me there. I must have looked broken, because for the first time in 5 years, her face changed. The mask of indifference cracked, and a flicker of something, fear, crossed her face. "Sophie, what's wrong? Are you sick?" I couldn't hold it in anymore. The dam inside me broke, and 5 years of silence came pouring out in a single, ragged sob. "I called him," I choked out, the words tearing at my throat. "I called him, and he has a new family. He has 2 little boys, and he told me not to call again." I finally looked at her, expecting to see the ice in her eyes, but it wasn't there. She looked pale, shocked. She stared at me, at the wreck I had become, and something inside her seemed to crumble. She sat down on the bed next to me, not touching me, but just sitting there. "Oh, Sophie," she whispered, and her voice was filled with a pain that mirrored my own. "I'm so sorry." That one phrase, "I'm so sorry," was like a key turning in a lock that had been rusted shut for 5 years. It was a beginning. For the first time since my father walked out the door, my mother looked at me, truly looked at me, and saw the child who was drowning. The ice in her eyes had melted, and what was left was a deep, quiet ocean of her own regret. She didn't try to hug me right away. Instead, she just sat there, a witness to my heartbreak. And then, she started to talk. Her voice was low and unsteady, filled with the ghosts of years of silence. "It was never you, Sophie," she said, her hands twisting in her lap. "God, it was never, ever you. It was me. And it was him. He said he couldn't do it anymore. The responsibilities, the bills, being a husband, being a father. He said he felt trapped. That day, the day he left. He told me he was leaving me because I had chosen to have you. She finally looked up, her eyes pleading with me to understand something that was impossible. He said if it wasn't for you, we could have been different, that you were the anchor holding him down. He said it to hurt me, Sophie. It was his excuse to be a coward. And I was so broken, so full of hate for him. I took the ugliest, most painful thing he said, and I threw it at you, because you were all I had left. It was the cruelest, most unforgivable thing I have ever done. I put his failure on your shoulders. The boulder that had been sitting between us for all those years finally cracked. It wasn't my fault. It was never my fault. The words echoed in the space where the silence used to live. My sobs changed from the sharp cries of fresh pain to the deep, shuddering breaths of release. I wasn't the reason. I was the excuse. She reached out then, hesitantly, and her hand rested on my back. It was a small, uncertain touch, but it was more warmth than I had felt from her in years. I leaned into it, and for the first time, we cried together. We cried for the man who had left, for the family he had broken, and for the 5 years that had been stolen from us by a lie whispered in a moment of despair. Later that evening, I showed her the blue sweater. I pulled it out from under my mattress, faded and worn. She took it, her fingers tracing the worn wool, and a fresh wave of tears fell down her face. I was so angry. I tried to get rid of everything, she whispered. I'm so glad you saved this. Things didn't become perfect overnight. There was no magic switch to erase the years of distance. But the silence was gone. The next morning, she didn't just leave a cupcake on the table. She sat with me while I ate my toast. She asked me about my homework. I told her about the science project I had to do, and she offered to help me with the research. It was a small thing, but it was everything. We started talking, finding our way back to each other, one hesitant conversation at a time. We were two broken people learning how to build a new kind of family from the wreckage of the old one. My father was a ghost, a memory of a man who loved me less than he loved his own freedom. But my mother, she was real, and she was trying. The most important lessons in life are often the hardest to learn. They teach us that people are not simple. They are messy and complicated, capable of great love and profound cruelty, sometimes in the very same breath. Forgiveness is not about forgetting. It is about choosing to see the person behind the mistake and finding the strength to let go of the pain that holds you captive. My mother's words hurt me, but her silence almost destroyed me. In the end, it was her apology that set me free. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who might need a message of hope. You never know who is quietly carrying a burden that a few honest words could help to lift.